At the wedding, my son grabbed the microphone and confessed he always hated his last name. The room went silent. Everyone stared at him, then turned their judgmental eyes toward me. They expected shame. They expected the silence I had kept for 30 years. But they did not know I had prepared for this moment. The real blow to their prestigious legacy has not even begun. My name is Eleanor Briggs, and at 56 years old, I have learned that the most brutal exclusions often happen in the most beautiful rooms. I sat at table 19, a designated exile positioned so far back in the gilded ballroom that I could feel the draft every time the kitchen staff swung the service doors open. This was a wedding in Wellesley, a wealthy enclave just outside Boston where money smelled like old paper and fresh lilies. While my ex-husband and his pristine family occupied the dais directly in front of the stage, I was surrounded by distant cousins and business associates who politely ignored me. The reception was a masterpiece of orchestrated wealth. The tablecloths were white linen, thick and heavy enough to smother a fire. A 12-piece live band played jazz standards with effortless precision, and waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts, refilling champagne flutes before they were even half empty. The Caldwell family, Harper's relatives, looked like a magazine spread of American royalty, draped in silk and custom tailoring. In contrast, I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress. It was a department store purchase I had bought on sale for $80. Amidst a sea of designer gowns that cost more than my first car, I felt like a smudge of dirt on a diamond. Graham Whitfield stood on the stage, tapping a crystal glass with a silver spoon. My ex-husband had aged into the kind of silver fox that law firm brochures loved to feature. He was now a senior partner, radiating authority and self-importance. To the Whitfield legacy, Graham boomed, his voice projecting without a tremor. And to the heritage we leave for the generations to come, Daniel is the finest example of what it means to be a Whitfield. Strong, principled, a leader. The applause was polite and rhythmic. I took a sip of water, my throat dry. Just to my left, Elaine Whitfield, my former mother-in-law, leaned toward a woman in a pearl necklace. She did not bother to lower her voice. "It is a blessing he is no longer attached to Briggs," Elaine whispered, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. What does that country girl's name even mean? Absolutely nothing. Her eyes flicked toward me, cold and dismissive, before returning to the stage. I gripped my water glass until my knuckles turned white, but I forced my face to remain blank. I had practiced this expression for decades. Instead of looking at her, I focused on my son. Daniel Whitfield sat next to his bride, Harper Caldwell. He looked nauseous. While the room toasted his illustrious surname, he was twisting his linen napkin into a tight, strangled knot. His smile was a brittle mask. I knew that look. It was the look of a man wearing a suit of armor that was slowly crushing his ribs. Harper took the microphone next. She was radiant, the perfect match for a Whitfield. She spoke about the perfect intersection of two powerful families and thanked the Whitfields for shaping Daniel into the man he is today. There was no mention of the mother who had nursed him through fevers, the mother who had checked his homework every night, the mother who was currently sitting by the kitchen door. I was erased from the narrative entirely. Then, Daniel stood up. He was not scheduled to speak yet. The program on the table clearly stated that the first dance was next. Daniel took the microphone from his wife's hand. The feedback whined for a split second, silencing the room. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning past the rows of wealthy lawyers and investors until they locked onto mine. The ballroom went completely still. Daniel took a breath that sounded painful, like he was inhaling broken glass. "Before we dance, I have something to say," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly before steadying. I always hated this last name." The silence that followed was heavy and physical. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Graham's face turned a violent shade of purple, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. Elaine looked as if she had been slapped. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in my chest. But I felt the corner of my mouth twitch upward. "You just fired the first shot." "Danny?" I thought, a surge of adrenaline sharpening my vision. "I will handle the rest." They thought this was a drunken outburst or a momentary lapse in judgment. They did not know that this was the first domino in a line I had been arranging for years. But to understand why a groom would detonate his own inheritance on his wedding day, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back 30 years. To the day I was foolish enough to agree to become a Whitfield. To understand the explosion at the wedding, you have to go back to the 90s. I was Eleanor Briggs then, the daughter of a truck driver and a grocery store clerk from a dusty town in Ohio. I had calluses on my hands and a laugh that was a little too loud for polite society. Then I met Graham Whitfield. He was a law student in his final year, possessing the kind of easy confidence that only comes from generations of money. Graham courted me like a prince rescuing a peasant in a fairy tale. He took me to galas where the champagne cost more than my father made in a week. He introduced me to his friends not as a waitress, but as his muse. "This is Eleanor," he would say, his arm heavy around my waist. "She is the girl who brings me real inspiration. When we are married, her life is going to turn a completely new chapter." I believed him. I did not see the trap. I only saw the shine. But his family saw me clearly from the very first dinner. I remember sitting in their dining room, the silence stretching thin as Elaine Whitfield inspected me over her soup spoon. "And where did you say you studied?" dear Elaine asked. "Community college?" "Ma'am," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I worked days and studied nights." Elaine offered a tight, pitying smile. "Oh, community college. That is quaint. It is where people go when they lack the proper foundation, I suppose. But you seem sweet, teachable." She tolerated me because she thought I was soft clay she could mold. Our wedding was spectacular, a blur of white roses and flashbulbs. But the only moment that sticks in my memory is signing the marriage license. I watched the pen scratch out Eleanor Briggs and replace it with Eleanor Whitfield. My mother hugged me afterward, smelling of cheap hairspray and tears. "You lost our name. Elle." She sobbed into my shoulder. "You really lost it." I thought she was being dramatic, but she was prophetic. As soon as the ink was dry, Graham began to edit me. The changes were small at first. He replaced my wardrobe, piece by piece. "You are a Whitfield now," he would say, holding up a beige silk blouse. "We do not wear bright prints. We do not speak with that twang. You have a reputation to uphold." He cut away my friends, my hobbies, and my voice until I was just a reflection of him. When Daniel was born, the erasure became absolute. The Whitfields threw a lavish welcome party for the baby. Graham stood by the fireplace, giving a speech about the new heir to the Whitfield legacy. My parents, the Briggs family, were seated in a dark corner of the room near the kitchen entrance, treated like uninvited guests at their own grandson's celebration. I remember when Daniel was a toddler. My father had given him a small baseball cap with Briggs stitched on the back. Daniel found it one afternoon and put it on. Giggling, "Briggs," he chirped. "I am Briggs." Elaine swooped down like a hawk. She snatched the hat off his head and tossed it into the trash can. "No, sweet boy," she said, her voice dripping with poisonous honey. "You are a Whitfield. Do not dirty your mouth with those words." I stood there and said nothing. I was too afraid to fight them. But that night, I retrieved the hat from the trash. I hid it in an old shoebox in the back of my closet, along with a photograph of my parents and a handkerchief my mother had embroidered with the initials E.B. It was my secret museum of the woman I used to be. Over the years, the golden cage lost its luster. Graham came home later and later, claiming he had billable hours to finish. He started coming to bed smelling of a perfume that was musky and unfamiliar, something far more expensive than what I wore. He stopped looking at me, except to critique my appearance before charity events where my only job was to stand beside him. Just smile and nod. "Eleanor." He would instruct me in the car. "Do not try to be clever. Just be decorative." The breaking point of my silence, though not yet, my action came when Daniel was 7. I made the mistake of telling him that he could be whoever he wanted to be when he grew up, that names did not define him. Graham overheard me. He slammed his hand onto the kitchen counter, making the fine china rattle. "Do not fill his head with that garbage." Graham snarled, his face inches from mine. "My son's entire life will be attached to this name. He is a Whitfield. That is his currency. And you are a Whitfield too. If you want to remain in this house." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that to him, we were not people. We were assets, and assets could be liquidated. The collapse of my marriage did not happen with a scream, but with the quiet rustle of paper. 3 years later, I found the evidence tucked inside the glove compartment of Graham's Mercedes. It was a receipt for the Four Seasons, listing a suite for 2, followed by a credit card statement I was never meant to see. There were charges for jewelry stores I had never entered and dinners I had never eaten. When I searched the car further, I found a single diamond stud earring wedged deep into the seam of the passenger seat. It was delicate, expensive, and definitely not mine. I confronted Graham in our marble-floored kitchen while he was pouring himself a scotch. I threw the receipt and the earring onto the counter. He did not flinch. He did not apologize. He simply took a sip of his drink and looked at me with a mixture of boredom and pity. "Eleanor, please," Graham said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "You need to grow up. In this tax bracket, everyone has secrets. It is how we survive the pressure." "You are cheating on me," I said, my voice trembling. "And you are spending our money to do it." He laughed, a cold, dry sound. "My money, Eleanor, and you should learn to be grateful for the lifestyle it provides. If you want to keep being sheltered by the Whitfield name, I suggest you learn to look the other way." I filed for divorce the next morning. I was naive. I thought the legal system was designed to protect the wronged party. I soon learned that the courtroom is not about truth. It is about who can afford the better storyteller. Graham hired a team of sharks who cost $500 an hour. I had a public defender who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. The worst part was not the money. It was Elaine. My mother-in-law took the stand, dressed in a modest grey suit, wiping away imaginary tears with a lace handkerchief. "Eleanor is unstable," Elaine told the judge, her voice quivering with practiced concern. She has these emotional episodes. We worry about Daniel. We just want to ensure the boy is safe. It was a lie. I had never raised a hand against my son. I was the one who packed his lunch, the one who read him bedtime stories, the one who bandaged his scraped knees. But the judge looked at the weeping grandmother and the distinguished father, then looked at me, the frantic, angry woman with no money, and made up his mind. They backed me into a corner. Graham's lawyer slid a settlement across the mahogany table. It was brutal. The Whitfields would keep the house, the investments, and the majority of the assets. In exchange, I would get primary physical custody of Daniel. But there was a catch, a clause written in bold ink. If you want the boy, the lawyer said, tapping the paper, you agree to the terms. Daniel remains a Whitfield. He attends Whitfield-approved schools. He is raised in the family tradition. If you try to change his name or alienate him from his heritage, we will bury you in litigation until you are homeless. They held my son's identity hostage. I signed the papers because I had no choice. I left the mansion with 2 suitcases, a rusted Honda Civic, and my 8-year-old son holding my hand. As we walked away from the house that was no longer ours, Daniel looked up at me, his eyes wide and confused. "Mom," he whispered, squeezing my hand. I like Briggs better, but I don't want Grandma to be mad." "I know." "Baby," I said, choking back tears. "I know." We moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town. The walls were thin, and the radiator clanked all night. To pay the rent, I took 2 jobs. By day, I was a data entry clerk, typing until my fingers cramped. By night, I worked at a legal call center, listening to strangers scream about their lawsuits. I was exhausted, but I made sure Daniel never saw me cry. Daniel grew up straddling 2 incompatible worlds. On weekends, the Whitfields picked him up in a limousine. They treated him like the heir to a throne, filling his head with talk of legacy and power. On weekdays, he was with me, eating frozen pizza at a wobbly kitchen table and doing his homework while I balanced our checkbook, trying to stretch $20 to last until Friday. He learned to be silent about his preferences. He learned to wear the Whitfield name like a heavy coat he could not take off. One late night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the kitchen under the buzzing fluorescent light. I pulled out my copy of the divorce decree. I took a red pen and circled the paragraph that mandated Daniel's last name. I stared at the words until they blurred. One day, I whispered to the empty room. One day, I will take back my name, and I will make them pay for every single tear. My resurrection did not happen in a church, but in a windowless room filled with cardboard boxes. I was working data entry for a small, scrappy law firm downtown. It was mind-numbing work for most people, typing numbers from bank statements into spreadsheets for 8 hours a day. But for me, it was a revelation. I realized I had a talent for spotting the invisible. I could see the patterns in the chaos. I noticed when a decimal point was shifted to hide an asset, or when a series of shell company transactions did not quite add up. One afternoon, a junior associate named Lydia stopped by my desk. She was young, ambitious, and drowning in discovery documents for a massive fraud case. I handed her a stack of papers I had flagged. "Lydia," I said, pointing to a highlighted row, "look at the dates on these transfers. They match the exact days the CEO claimed he was out of the country." Lydia stared at the page, her eyes widening. She looked at me, then back at the paper. "Eleanor," she breathed, her voice dropping to a whisper. You just won the case." "How did you see that I just read what is there?" I replied, shrugging. 2 months later, Lydia left the firm to start her own practice, and she took me with her. Not as a secretary, but as a partner in a new venture. We sat in a coffee shop, sketching out the business plan on a napkin. "We need a name," Lydia said, tapping her pen against the table. "Something strong. Something that sounds like we dig for the truth." I did not hesitate. "Briggs Forensic Services." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "Briggs, is that your maiden name?" "It is my real name," I said firmly. "On my driver's license, I was still Eleanor Whitfield, but in the professional world, the name Briggs began to develop teeth. We started small, helping divorce lawyers find hidden offshore accounts and assisting small businesses in catching embezzling managers. I became a ghost in the legal community. Big firms hated me because I found the holes in their impeccably drafted contracts. I was the invisible woman who turned over the rocks they wanted to keep undisturbed. Then came the day the name appeared on my screen. I was reviewing a stack of subpoenaed documents for a commercial real estate dispute. It was a standard breach of contract case, boring and dry, until I saw the letterhead of the opposing counsel, Whitfield and Lowe. My heart stopped for a second. It was Graham's firm. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was his. The document was a motion to dismiss, filled with the kind of arrogant, flowery language he used to use at the dinner table. My instinct was to burn it, or to panic. Instead, I felt a cold, sharp clarity. I noticed a discrepancy in the billing hours listed in the attached exhibit. It was minor, just a few $1,000s padded into the expense report. But it was there. I did not use it. Not yet. I simply saved a copy of the file, encrypted it, and started a new folder on my hard drive labeled Project W. Over the next decade, Briggs Forensic Services evolved into Briggs Analytics. We moved from a basement office to a sleek suite in the financial district. We handled high-stakes corporate investigations and compliance audits. I bought a spacious condo with a view of the harbour, paid off my old debts, and built a retirement portfolio that would have made Elaine Whitfield choke on her tea. But I did it all quietly, to the Whitfields, and even to Daniel. I was still just Mom, the woman who did boring paperwork for lawyers to make ends meet. I never corrected them. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked me one evening. He was visiting from college, sitting at my kitchen counter while I worked on my laptop. "You're working really late, just finishing up some invoices." I lied, closing the window that showed a flowchart of shell companies linked to a Whitfield client. "How is school?" "It is good." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Dad is pushing me to intern at the firm next summer. He says it is vital for my future." I looked at my son. He looked so tired, carrying the weight of an expectation he never asked for. He had no idea that while he was learning how to build a case, I was slowly, methodically building the weapon that would dismantle his father's legacy. I started keeping everything. Every time Whitfield and Lowe crossed my desk, which happened frequently as my firm grew, I archived the data. I found ambiguous retainer agreements, conflicts of interest that were conveniently ignored, and settlement payments that looked suspiciously like bribes. I kept a physical backup in a fireproof safe at the bank. That night, after Daniel fell asleep on my sofa, surrounded by his heavy law textbooks, I stayed up watching him. The light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across his face. He looked peaceful, dreaming of a future where he would be a great lawyer, a good Whitfield. I turned back to my laptop, where a spreadsheet of Graham's billable hours was glowing on the screen. "You are growing up to carry a name that I am secretly burying alive," I thought, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I am sorry, Danny. But one day, you will thank me." When Daniel was accepted into law school, the hostility from the Whitfield camp shifted into a patronizing form of ownership. Graham sent me an email, copying his entire partner list, boasting that our son was interning at the firm. Elaine told anyone who would listen that Daniel was truly a Whitfield, conveniently ignoring the fact that the tuition checks clearing every semester were signed by me, funded by the profits of Briggs Analytics. They saw his success as genetic inevitability. I knew it was bought with sleepless nights and my own hard-earned money. Then Daniel met Harper Caldwell. Harper was lovely. She was sharp, kind, and genuinely in love with my son. But her last name carried the weight of a granite monument. The Caldwells owned a massive real estate empire that spanned half of New England. When Daniel introduced us, he looked terrified. "Mom," he said, fidgeting with his tie, "just be careful." The Caldwells are very old school. They care a lot about pedigree. Harper treated me with respect, but her parents looked at me the way a museum curator looks at a cheap reproduction. To them, I was a footnote. They saw the name Whitfield attached to Daniel and saw a merger, not a marriage. The reality of this transaction became clear one rainy Tuesday evening. Daniel came to my apartment, looking pale. He slumped onto my sofa and refused the tea I offered. "Dad and Mr. Caldwell had a meeting today," Daniel said, staring at the floor. "They are discussing a long-term retainer. Whitfield and Lowe will represent Caldwell Holdings exclusively after the wedding. Dad called it a perfect intersection of two powerful families." My stomach turned. It was not a wedding. It was a business acquisition. A week later, Elaine called me. Her voice was sugary, the tone she used when she was about to deliver an insult wrapped in silk. "Eleanor, darling, we are finalizing the seating chart," she chirped. "Now, because of the press coverage and the image we need to project for the firm. We have put you at table 19. It is in the back, but the view is still decent. The front tables are strictly for the official Whitfield and Caldwell parties. You understand? Do you not?" "I understand perfectly. Elaine," I said, my voice flat. I hung up before she could offer more fake apologies. I learned later from a friend in the catering business that Graham had told the Caldwells I was never really suited for this world and that I had contributed nothing to Daniel's success. They thought I was powerless. They had no idea that the universe was about to hand me a loaded gun. By sheer coincidence, a boutique investment fund hired Briggs Analytics to conduct a risk assessment on Caldwell Holdings before a potential capital injection. It was a standard due diligence contract. But when I opened the data room, the name Whitfield and Lowe was stamped on every other document. I sat in my office, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark room, and I started digging. It did not take long. I found invoices for legal consulting that were 3 times the market rate. I found vague contracts for retainer services that looked suspiciously like kickbacks disguised as billable hours. Graham was not just representing the Caldwells, he was milking them, and someone on the inside was letting it happen. Then I found the draft of the post-nuptial agreement. It was buried in a subfolder labeled Estate Planning. I scrolled to the bottom. and my blood ran cold. There was a clause regarding future children. It stated, in unambiguous legal jargon, that any issue born of this union shall bear the surname Whitfield Caldwell, prioritizing Graham's name over the real estate empire's legacy. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the computer server the only sound in the room. They were not just trading money. They were trading my son. They were using him and his unborn children as pawns in a vanity project to stroke Graham's ego. They are using my boy like a poker chip. I whispered to the empty office. And they think I am just going to sit at table 19 and smile. I closed the laptop. The investigation was no longer just business. It was an execution order. The humiliation began before I even entered the room. When I arrived at the hotel for the rehearsal dinner, dressed in my best charcoal suit, a frantic event coordinator blocked my path near the entrance. He glanced at my sensible shoes and the lack of diamonds at my throat, then pointed sharply toward the service elevators. Deliveries and setup crew need to use the rear loading dock. Ma'am, he snapped, checking his clipboard. We have the families arriving any minute. I had to grit my teeth and explain that I was the mother of the groom. He apologized, but the damage was done. Inside, the Whitfields and Caldwells were already arranged on the riser, posing for a photographer like a royal court, while I stood on the periphery, watching the flashbulbs pop. Graham greeted me with a performance of civility that made my skin crawl. He leaned in, kissing the air beside my cheek, and turned to the Caldwells' extended family. "And this is Eleanor," Graham announced, his hand hovering over my shoulder without actually touching me. "Daniel's mother. She stays busy with, some light paperwork filing, part-time, I believe." A ripple of polite, condescending laughter went around the table. They looked at me with the soft eyes one uses for a beloved, simple-minded pet. "Mrs." Caldwell asked me exactly one question about the weather before turning her back to me entirely. She leaned across the centerpiece to speak to Graham regarding the post-nuptial adjustments, she said, her voice low but distinct. "We need to ensure the trust fund distribution aligns with the sheer magnitude of the merger." They discussed my son's future like a merger and acquisition deal, and I was not even considered a shareholder. During the speeches, Graham stood up, swirling a glass of vintage red wine. He spoke for 10 minutes about the Whitfield steel that ran through Daniel's veins. He praised the discipline, sharpness, and ambition that the name carried. "And, of course," Graham added as an afterthought, barely glancing in my direction, "Eleanor certainly kept him safe when he was small." That was it. My entire contribution to my son's life was reduced to basic babysitting. Daniel was sitting next to me, and I saw his hand trembling against the tablecloth. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red. He looked like a man marching to the gallows. While the room erupted in applause for Graham, Daniel stood up abruptly and grabbed my elbow. "Mom," he whispered, his voice tight. "I need air." He dragged me out to the terrace balcony. The city lights of Boston shimmered in the distance, indifferent to our drama. Daniel gripped the stone railing until his knuckles turned white. He took a gulp of the whiskey he had brought with him, breathing hard. "Mom, I always hated this last name," he confessed, the words tearing out of him. "I hate hearing them say I am a good Whitfield. It makes me feel like I am just his product, and not yours." I watched him, my heart breaking. "Why did you never tell me it was this bad? I wanted to change it to Briggs a dozen times," Daniel said, tears finally spilling over. But every time I brought it up, Dad reminded me of the tuition, the clerkships, the network. He said if I dropped the name, I would be burning my future. And now he wants to put a clause in his will. Only grandchildren named Whitfield get the inheritance. I feel like I'm in a chokehold. He looked at me, his eyes desperate and young, the same look he used to give me when he scraped his knee on the playground. "Mom, is there any way out?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Is there a way to not live and die with this name?" Without destroying my entire life, I stepped closer and took his face in my hands. I realized I had been protecting him from the truth for too long. It was time to weaponize the truth. "Daniel, listen to me," I said, my voice steady and hard as flint. "I do not just do paperwork. I own Briggs Analytics. I know everything about your father's firm. I know where the bodies are buried because I am the one who found the shovel." He stared at me, confusion warring with shock. "If you want to be free," I told him, looking straight into his eyes, "we will finish this. We will end the Whitfield name together. Right at your wedding. Do you trust me?" Daniel looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was a small movement, but it sealed the fate of the entire Whitfield dynasty. I left the rehearsal dinner while the rest of the party was still intoxicated on expensive wine and false promises. I drove back to my apartment in silence. The hum of the tires on the asphalt, the only sound accompanying my racing thoughts. As soon as I walked through the door, I did not take off my heels. I went straight to the painting in my study, swung it aside, and spun the dial on my wall safe. Inside lay the ammunition I had been stockpiling for a decade. I pulled out the thickest folder, labelled simply Whitfield and Lowe, Caldwell, Misk. I sat at my desk and dialed Lydia. It was late, but I knew she would be awake. "Lydia," I said as soon as she picked up. "I need the summary report, the specific file on the Caldwell accounts. I need every padded hour, every suspicious subcontractor, and every kickback disguised as a consultation fee. I need timestamps and sources. I need it. Right now." Eleanor Lydia's voice was thick with sleep, but sharpened instantly. "You are finally doing it tonight. I confirmed. Send it to my secure server. For the next 2 hours, I worked with the precision of a diamond cutter. I assembled 3 identical digital dossiers. The first was addressed to the State Bar Ethics Committee. The second went to the Chief Compliance Officer at Caldwell Holdings. The third went to an investigative journalist at the Boston Globe who had been trying to nail Graham's firm for years. I hovered my finger over the enter key. This was not just a whistleblowing act. It was a demolition. I pressed send while the files were uploading. I called my personal attorney to verify the statutes one last time. Daniel was 26. He was a legal adult. He did not need his father's permission to change his name. He only needed his own consent. I copied the link to the state's expedited electronic filing portal and texted it to Daniel. My message was short. "If you really want this, I have arranged it so the filing takes effect this morning. The decision is yours." I did not sleep. The sun was barely bleeding into the sky when I parked my car in front of City Hall. I checked the portal on my phone. The status bar had turned green. He had done it. He had signed the electronic forms at 3 a.m. I walked into the clerk's office the moment they unlocked the doors. I paid the expedited fee and requested the certified copy. When the clerk handed me the document, I stared at the name typed in bold black letters. Daniel Graham Whitfield was gone. In his place was Daniel Briggs Caldwell. He had taken my name. He had taken Harper's name. He had erased the Whitfield legacy completely. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into a cream-colored envelope. I placed it in my clutch purse right next to a silver USB drive containing the full forensic report on Graham's fraud. These were my weapons, one for the heart, one for the wallet. I snapped the purse shut. As I was driving to the church, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the legal counsel at Caldwell Holdings. The subject line was succinct, receipt acknowledged. The body of the email was formal and cold. We have received the anonymous report. Given the severity of the documentation, we are suspending all pending agreements with Whitfield and Lowe, effective immediately, to conduct an internal audit. I smiled as I turned into the church parking lot. The first shot had hit its target, and the victim did not even know he was bleeding yet. Inside the church, the air smelled of lilies and old money. I saw Graham standing near the altar, laughing with Mr. Caldwell. Graham looked triumphant, the king of a castle built on sand. I could hear his booming voice from where I stood. This partnership will define the next 40 years of legal practice in Boston. Graham bragged, clapping Harper's father on the back. A true dynasty. He had absolutely no idea that his timeline had just been cut down to minutes. I walked past them and slipped into the ladies' restroom. I stood before the mirror, smoothing the fabric of my dress. On the vanity counter lay a discarded invitation addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield. I picked it up and looked at it one last time. Just a few more hours, I whispered to my reflection, my eyes hard and bright. Then this name dies right here. The ceremony took place in a cathedral that smelled of beeswax candles and centuries of judgment. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long, coloured shadows across the stone floor. It was a beautiful setting for a merger. On the left side of the aisle sat the Caldwells, a sea of blonde hair and navy suits, radiating the easy power of old money. On the right sat the Whitfields, looking sharp and hungry. I sat in the last pew on the bride's side, the only place where there was an empty seat, watching the back of my son's head. When the priest asked who gave the bride away, Harper's father stood up, his chest puffing out. "Her mother and I do," Mr. Caldwell announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Graham nodded from the front row, looking satisfied. He was not looking at the couple. He was looking at the Caldwells, as if he were mentally counting the assets that were about to be consolidated. The priest began to speak about the sanctity of marriage and the joining of two historic families. He mentioned the Whitfield legacy twice. Each time he said it, I saw Daniel's shoulders tense up under his tuxedo jacket. Then came the moment that always makes the air leave the room. "If anyone here knows of any just cause why these two may not be joined in holy matrimony," the priest intoned, looking over his spectacles at the congregation, "speak now or forever. Hold your peace." A heavy silence descended upon the church. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. I gripped my clutch purse so tightly that the leather creaked. Inside was the envelope that would burn their world down. I could have stood up then. I could have waved the forensic report in the air. But I stayed seated. I did not want to stop the wedding. I wanted them married. I wanted the alliance to be sealed so that when I broke it, the shatter would be irreversible. The silence passed. The vows were exchanged. The organ roared to life. By the time we reached the hotel ballroom for the reception, The sun had set, and the mood had shifted from solemn to triumphant. Waiters circulated with silver trays, and a jazz band played soft, expensive music. It felt less like a celebration of love and more like a victory lap for a corporate takeover. During the dinner service, Harper's father took the stage. He raised a glass of champagne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. To the future of Caldwell Holdings, he toasted, beaming at the crowd. And to our selected partners who will walk that path with us, we are proud to have the legal excellence of Graham Whitfield and his firm guiding our family's interests. The room erupted in applause. Graham stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smug grin. He took the microphone, basking in the adoration. "We are building something that will outlast all of us," Graham declared, his eyes sweeping over the guests but sliding right past me. "Decades from now, people will remember the Whitfield name. They will look at Daniel and his children and see the strength of this lineage." As he spoke, my eyes drifted to the back of the room. I saw Marcus, the chief legal officer for Caldwell Holdings. He was looking down at his phone. I watched his expression shift from boredom to confusion, and then to absolute shock. He tapped the screen, scrolling rapidly. Then he looked up, his eyes locking onto Graham's back with a look of pure horror. He immediately turned and walked briskly out of the ballroom, holding his phone to his ear. I took a slow sip of my water. The email had been opened. The poison was in the bloodstream. And now, the master of ceremonies announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "It is time for a very special tradition. Please welcome the groom, Daniel Whitfield, and his mother, Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, to the dance floor." The spotlight swung around the room, searching for me. Heads turned. I could see the whispers starting. They were looking for the ex-wife, the outsider. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my skirt and walked toward the dance floor. I did not look at the ground. I looked straight ahead, holding my purse in my left hand. Daniel met me in the center of the floor. He looked pale, sweating slightly under the lights. He took my hand, and his palm was clammy. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the opening notes of the song. I did it?" I glanced down at his chest, tucked into the inner pocket of his tuxedo. Just barely visible was the edge of a folded paper. I could see the raised texture of the official court seal. "I know," I whispered back, placing my hand on his shoulder. "I am so proud of you." The music swelled, a slow, sentimental ballad that felt completely at odds with the adrenaline pumping through my veins. We began to sway. Graham was watching us from the head table, smiling that condescending smile, thinking he had won everything. He had the merger. He had the son. He had the legacy. He had no idea that in 3 minutes, when the music stopped, his son was going to walk to the microphone and decapitate the Whitfield name in front of 300 witnesses. The final note of the song faded into the high ceiling, but Daniel did not step back. Instead, he reached out and took the microphone from the master of ceremonies. The room was still applauding, a polite wash of noise that masked the tension radiating off my son. Graham was clapping the loudest from the head table, his smile wide and predatory, expecting a speech about gratitude and the honor of carrying his surname. Daniel took a breath that shuddered in the amplified silence. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the Caldwells in their pearls, and the Whitfields in their arrogance. And then he looked at me. Growing up, Everyone kept telling me to be a good Whitfield, Daniel said, his voice cracking slightly before finding its footing. But the truth is, I always hated this last name. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Elaine Whitfield shot out of her chair as if she had been electrocuted, her hand flying to her throat. The murmurs started like a rising tide, confused and angry. Graham's smile froze, then shattered into a rictus of confusion. Daniel did not stop. He gripped the microphone stand with both hands. That name never stood for excellence to me, Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. It stood for pressure. It stood for lies. It stood for watching my mother be silenced and humiliated at dinner tables just like this one. Just so she could keep a roof over my head. I thought I had to carry it to have a future. I thought I was trapped. He turned to look directly at me, and for the first time in his life, he looked completely free. The person who taught me integrity, persistence, and respect for justice is my mother, Eleanor Briggs, Daniel announced, his voice ringing clear. I have been carrying the wrong name for more than 30 years. Daniel reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out the folded document. He unfolded it and held it up to the light. The embossed seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts caught the glare of the chandelier. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I am legally no longer a Whitfield, Daniel declared. My name is Daniel Briggs Caldwell. Cameras flashed in a blinding staccato. Graham's face drained of all colour, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under heat. At the Caldwell table, Harper's father frowned deeply. He leaned over and whispered frantically to his personal attorney. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Every contract, every trust fund, and every partnership agreement they had just drafted was contingent on a specific lineage that had just been legally erased. Graham snapped. He lunged toward the stage, his composure abandoning him entirely. This is absurd, Graham screamed, trying to grab the microphone from his own son. This is an impulsive, childish stunt. You cannot just wipe away history like this. You are a Whitfield. The control he had maintained for decades cracked wide open. The guests watched in horror as the distinguished lawyer turned into a desperate, shouting man. I stepped forward. I did not shout. I did not need to. I took the microphone from Daniel's hand as he stepped back to stand beside his wife. If we are speaking about history and names, I said, my voice low but amplified to every corner of the room, we should tell the whole story. Graham glared at me, his eyes bulging. Eleanor, sit down. Do not embarrass yourself. I am not embarrassed. Graham, I replied calmly. I am clarifying the record. You told everyone I do paperwork. That is true. I am the founder and CEO of Briggs Analytics. My firm specializes in forensic accounting and fraud detection. I reached into my purse and pulled out the silver USB drive. I held it up so the light caught the metal. For the past 6 months, Briggs Analytics has been auditing the contracts between Whitfield and Lowe and Caldwell Holdings, I said, looking directly at Mr. Caldwell. We found over $2 million in padded billable hours, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and kickbacks disguised as consultation fees. I sent the full report to your compliance department this morning. The room went dead silent. It was the silence of a tomb. At that exact moment, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. Marcus, the legal director for Caldwell Holdings, walked in. He looked grim. He walked straight to Mr. Caldwell's table and whispered something in his ear. Mr. Caldwell stood up slowly. He looked at Graham, then at me, and finally at the USB drive in my hand. He buttoned his jacket with a crisp, final movement. Graham, Mr. Caldwell said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room. We are suspending all operations with your firm pending a federal investigation, effective immediately. He turned to look at Daniel and Harper, giving them a curt nod of approval. And regarding the new paperwork, Mr. Caldwell added, his eyes cold as ice as they swept over Graham. Make sure the name on the letterhead is Briggs, not Whitfield. Graham tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled, wet sound. He wiped sweat from his forehead, looking around the room for allies who were no longer there. This is insane, Graham stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are trying to ruin our son's wedding because you are jealous. These are lies, fabrications. They are bank statements. Graham, I replied, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. I have the emails where you authorized the shell accounts. I have the dates. I have the wire transfers that correspond exactly to the times you told your partners you were vacationing. Elaine pushed her way to the front, her face twisted into a mask of pure venom. She looked at me with the hatred of a woman watching her dynasty burn. You vengeful little peasant, Elaine hissed, stepping toward me. How dare you? You are nothing but a... That is enough. The voice belonged to Harper. The bride stood next to Daniel, her white dress gleaming under the spotlights, looking every inch the matriarch of a new era. She was not looking at her husband. She was looking at her mother-in-law. I read the summary Eleanor sent me this morning, Harper announced, her voice steady. I know about the fraud. I know about the coercion. Today is not just a wedding. It is the day the Whitfield control over this family ends. Harper's father, Mr. Caldwell, stepped forward. He had played golf with Graham for 20 years, but business was business. Graham, Mr. Caldwell said, his tone final. If these allegations are true, and they certainly look substantial, Caldwell Holdings will be fully cooperating with the authorities. We do not attach our name to fraud. Before Graham could respond, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened again. 2 men in dark suits entered. They were not police officers, but to a lawyer, they were worse. They were investigators from the State Bar Ethics Committee. I had invited them. They walked straight to the stage. The music had stopped completely. Mr. Whitfield, one of the agents said quietly, though in the silence. Everyone heard it. We need to have a conversation about some complaints filed regarding your trust accounts. Now. Graham looked at the agents, then at the Caldwells, and finally at the room full of people watching his disintegration. He slumped. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind just a frightened, greedy old man in a tuxedo. He was escorted out of the ballroom, walking past the tables of people he had tried to impress for decades. His legacy crumbled with every step he took toward the exit. I turned to Daniel. I wanted everyone to hear this. You do not owe that name a single thing, I said, looking him in the eye. You do not have to live by the name of the man who was just escorted out of your own wedding. The room was paralyzed. The master of ceremonies, looking terrified, leaned into the microphone. Should we stop the reception? Harper grabbed Daniel's hand and raised it high. Absolutely not, Harper declared. The party continues. Today celebrates Daniel Briggs Caldwell and Harper Caldwell. And it celebrates the woman who fought to make sure he was free enough to be here. She nodded to the band. The drummer counted off. The MC cleared his throat, finding his professional voice again. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC boomed. Please welcome back to the floor the bride, the groom, and the mother of the groom. Miss Eleanor Briggs, for the first time in 30 years. My name rang out in a room full of millionaires, and nobody laughed. Nobody looked down. They applauded. I stepped back into Daniel's arms. We began to move to the music again. He pulled me close, resting his head on my shoulder just like he used to when he was a boy. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. You saved me. You did not just destroy him. You freed me. I smiled, resting my cheek against his lapel. I realized then that the best revenge was not burning the house down. It was evicting the tyrant and keeping the keys. As the song ended, I stepped to the edge of the dance floor. I looked up at the digital LED banner scrolling above the DJ booth. It no longer flashed the Whitfield name. It read, in bright, undeniable letters, the Caldwell, Briggs wedding reception. The name they had called trash, the name they had tried to bury, was now shining in lights over the ruins of their reputation. The debt was finally paid in full. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to hear where you guys are tuning in from. So please drop your location in the comments below to connect with the community. If you enjoyed this ride, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story get heard by even more people.